Hiya Monstaz. Yeah, we're still at the crossroads here, still trying to figure out which way to go. But after looking in the comments in the last video, I think we've all decided that we're gonna go to the Monstaz, I think we're tripping out here. Whoa, Monstaz, I'm getting a little sick here. I hope you guys are okay. Make sure to hold on to each other so we don't get lost in this psychedelic wherever we're at or what really happened. I'm not sure. Make sure to let me know in the comments. But what I do remember, Monstaz, is I have a story to share with you. Now, this is a 5-part series from the Reddit NoSleep. The story is called Sleep Paralysis. Okay, Monstaz, so while we're spinning around in this psychedelic trip, be sure to pop open some Crystal Pepsi and let the story begin. I woke up a few nights ago, completely unable to move. The lack of light told me that it was still sometime in the middle of the night, but despite wanting to, I was unable to roll over and check the time on my phone. This would alarm most people experience it for the first time, but unfortunately, sleep paralysis was a fairly regular occurrence for me. Never any bright light shining through my window with aliens wanting to abduct me or any of that weird stuff. I generally blamed it on being overworked and not getting enough rest several nights in a row, and then tried as hard as I could to ignore it and go back to sleep. At worst, I was usually stuck staring at one of my walls for a while, losing some of what little sleep I was able to get, usually. This night was different though. This time, there was something there. Something I could feel that made the room colder and filled me with fear. Or maybe the fear made me cold. I still can't tell. The little bit of light filtering through the windows from the moon and reflecting off my completely white walls gave me just enough visibility to see shapes. But I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary from the spot I was laying. My door was still shut. The window at the foot of my bed was closed. But somehow, I only sensed something behind me. I struggled to turn over, but I could not move a muscle. I waited for what seemed like 10 minutes, but nothing changed. There wasn't even a sound, only fear. The room felt like it was getting colder, and slowly, I was slipping away. I woke up the next morning and realized I must have finally fallen asleep. I sat up and looked around, but everything seemed entirely normal. No sign of anyone or anything having been in my room, but I still couldn't shake that feeling of total fear and despair. At least I finally understood how so many people with the same problem could think their experiences were real. I vowed to myself to make sure I got more sleep the next few days to avoid having a repeat of this previous night. The next 2 days were uneventful, and I was feeling more rested and productive at work than I had for a long time. It was Friday night, but I decided to stick to my plan to go to bed early with the added bonus of being able to sleep the next day. I fell asleep quickly this time. It was actually surprising when I woke up a few hours later and could not move. I had brought out an old alarm clock with a display just in case one of these episodes happened again, so this time I at least knew it was 2:02 a.m. without having to move. Apparently, lack of sleep wasn't the only trigger for my paralysis. At least there was no fear this time. I stared at the wall for a few minutes and closed my eyes to try to get back to sleep. I'm not sure if I actually fully fell asleep or not, but suddenly, I was staring at my alarm clock again. 2:11 a.m. Then it hit me. Overwhelming fear. It was behind me again, even though I was lying on my right side this time. At least I knew it was a figment of my imagination this time. I closed my eyes and tried to ignore it, until I felt it move. Now it was at the foot of my bed. I opened my eyes and looked down, but I still could not see anything strange. Still, there was only dead silence. I convinced myself again that there was nothing there and closed my eyes to go back to sleep. Then it moved a second time. Not slowly as though it walked around my bed, but an instantaneous jump. right in front of me. I forced myself to open my eyes one last time. 2:14 a.m. I slowly shifted my gaze away from the side table and I saw it. At the edge of my bed, there was an unmistakable shape of the top half of a head peering up at me. The almost non-existing light seemed incapable of illuminating the face at all. There was only pure darkness. I tried to look away, but now I found my eyes unable to move or close either. I don't know how I could tell, but it was staring at me and forcing me to stare back. I could feel my entire body shaking now from the fear. I stared into the face for what seemed like hours before it stood up, all the while forcing me to continue staring it into its eyes. Finally, it released me and I could look around again. It was only maybe 4 feet tall, barely standing over me at its full height. The outline against my wall showed that it had waist-length hair and looked as if it was wearing a dress. If I didn't know better, I would have thought it was a little girl, maybe 10 years old. I glanced again at my alarm clock. It was 2:15 a.m. Suddenly, I was staring into its eyes again, against my will. Then, the silence was broken by a whisper so harsh and malicious that the fear felt like a knife stabbing into my stomach. There were no words, just faint sounds as if I was overhearing a conversation that wasn't meant for me. I still couldn't break away from his gaze, but I could see his hand coming closer over the corner of my eye. More than that, I could feel it coming closer, and just away from my face. I wanted to scream, to run, at least look away, but as I was compelled to watch and listen to its whispering, I felt the hand next to my cheek now, as it allowed me to break away from its gaze. I closed my eyes and braced for what was coming next. I opened my eyes again and saw the clock, 3:27 a.m. No more little girl, no more fear. I threw off the covers, launched across my bed to get to the light switch by the door, and turned the lights on. The door was open this time. I grabbed the baseball bat from behind my headboard and proceeded to tear every inch of the house apart. Every window and door were locked. No signs of anything else taken or misplaced. But I know I closed that door. I knew I had to go back to bed, so I shut off all the lights again and headed to my room. I was putting my bat back and reaching for the switch again when I stopped dead. The wall above my bed was no longer white. Spanning from wall to wall and from floor to ceiling was a massive X, painted black. I looked at it longer as drips slowly formed and ran down the wall, and I realized it was just put there. No, it wasn't black. It was dark red. No, not paint. It was blood. Did I miss the sign before? Or did she come back? Doesn't matter. There was no way I was going to go back to sleep tonight. This did pose one problem. What I thought was a dream was, in fact, very, very real. It also posed the question, what did the sign mean? The blood trickled further down the wall, becoming unmistakably redder against the white wall as it thinned out. Whose blood was that? Nothing else happened the rest of the night. I turned all the lights back on and stayed in my living room watching TV and forcing myself to stay awake. I needed to make a plan on how to deal with this, and I knew I needed some extra protection. I'm sure the police would dismiss me as another crazy person. Weapons were no good since I can't exactly defend myself when I'm paralyzed. The only reasonable course of action seemed to be get a dog, so I looked up the closest pet store and went to check it out when they opened. I explained that I was looking for some theft protection. Don't need this guy thinking I'm unstable either. And he recommended a German Shepherd, as they are loyal and generally feared for their size and protectiveness. This made sense. They are very commonly used by law enforcement. after all. He only had one shepherd he described as friendly, but not good around kids. Sam, about 2 years old. This seemed like a perfect fit, full-grown but young enough to be alert and aggressive. So I agreed to take him home. I stopped at my bank ATM and took out $100 on my way home. Unfortunately, the duplex I was renting in had a rented agreement which stated that there was an extra deposit for keeping a pet. Understandable, but it still significantly increased the cost of getting a dog for protection. The owner lived in the other half of the duplex, so at least I could drop the money off on my way home. I arrived home and saw that the owner's car was in his driveway. Perfect opportunity. I knocked on the door 3 times, but never got an answer. I guess it would have to wait for later. I went home and proceeded to show Sam around every room to let him get acquainted. I also set up his food and water and put a large bed for him in the corner of my room before settling down to watch some TV. I was worried that Sam would take some time to adjust to a new environment, but he seemed to feel right at home and laid down next to my feet. I was just beginning to wonder how long it would take him to understand that I was his owner and that he needed to protect me. That's when Sam got tensed, jumped up, and looked at the front door. Then I heard the approaching footsteps as well. The mailbox next to the door squeaked slightly. The mailman. I was about to try to calm Sam and get him to lie back down, but that one squeak immediately set him off barking for at least 2 minutes. This was good, as long as my landlord did not kick me out due to the relatively thin walls and Sam barking at every little noise. That reminded me about the deposit, so I figured I should try to drop it off again since he undoubtedly had heard Sam and now knew I had a dog. I walked over to his door and knocked again. Still no answer. I stood and listened, but couldn't hear anything inside. I checked the driveway again, but his car hadn't moved. I walked around to the back door and knocked another time. No answer. No sounds inside. I went and looked through the kitchen window, but the place seemed like he hadn't been there for days. Everything was spotless. All the lights were off. No dishes in the sink. Empty. I checked through the living room window and, against my better judgment concerning privacy, but there wasn't a single sign of him. This didn't make sense. I never seen him leave without taking his car. I started walking around to my front door again when I finally noticed that the driver's door on his car wasn't completely closed. A mugging gone wrong? I approached the car slowly, but it looked like it was empty as well, until I reached the door. There he was, slumped down across both front seats, limp and lifeless. I didn't need to check for his pulse to already know that he was dead, but there was something not quite right about how he looked. He seemed more than just dead. He looked empty. I walked right up to the door and leaned in closer. There was definitely a wound on the back of his neck, like a bullet hole, but perfectly round. I changed my angle, but it didn't look like there was any sort of exit wound or really any other sign of assault or struggle at all. Then I realized that it was all too clean. If he had been stabbed, there would have been blood everywhere, and there'd be no hiding it on tan leather seats. It was as if every last drop had been perfectly removed from his body. The dots finally connected. This is where the blood on my wall came from. Should I call the cops? Where would I even begin by trying to explain? Hey, just found my landlord completely devoid of blood and I'm pretty sure some evil little girl sucked it out. Not a very believable story. Then again, I couldn't just leave him here to rot in his car. I had to fabricate the story. I had to make it look real. And I definitely needed to make sure that I wouldn't be accused. I went back to my house, grabbed a pry bar and some gloves from my toolbox, and headed through the back door over to my landlord's. I tried his door handle. Locked. Exactly what I needed. I looked around one final time and jammed the bar between the door and the frame. Pried hard and gave the door a solid kick. The door swung in, snapping some of the wooden trim off with it. A perfect forced entry. I walked through the kitchen and smashed a cup sitting on the counter with a bar. Headed to the dining room and turned a chair over. Then I went to the front door, unlocked it, and left it open as I walked through. Just another break-in gone wrong, as far as I was concerned. I put the gloves and pry bar away and slumped down on my couch, preparing what I would say to the dispatcher. I called the emergency services and simply explained that I had come home to find that my neighbor's front door was open with what looked like signs of a struggle inside, but no signs of my neighbor anywhere. They told me to stay put, wait for the officers to come and check things out. 10 minutes later, I heard the sirens coming. Sam perked up and listened intently. I did not want Sam to alarm the cops with more barking, so I headed out the door to meet them as soon as they got out their cars. I also didn't want to look guilty by hiding. I greeted them and explained that I had called them. They told me to go back inside while they checked out the other side of the duplex. They drew their sidearms and headed in. 5 minutes later, I saw them walk out the front door and head for my landlord's car. The closest officer stopped about a few feet away. He had seen the body. He motioned for his partner to come closer as he opened the door and reached inside. They holstered their weapons, and I saw the one who checked the car say something into his radio. I went out to greet them as they approached again, and they explained that my landlord was dead. Amidst the best fiend expression of shock I could muster, they asked some basic questions about how long I lived there and any info I could provide about my landlord, but they seemed to be operating under the assumptions that this was an attempted robbery. I went back inside to wait, and a few forensic investigators arrived within an hour to process the scene. From my window, I watched them remove the body, and then they spent about 4 hours photographing every detail and dusting a few areas for fingerprints. The investigators and the cops left around 8 o'clock. No mention of the fact that the body they found had all the blood removed, but they did say that they were going to send another officer to be posted outside for the night in the off chance that whoever it was came back. I thanked them and headed back inside to watch some TV until the officer arrived. I woke up paralyzed again, and I suddenly realized that I had fallen asleep on my couch. I looked over to the clock next to my TV, 12:42 a.m. Then I realized that the fear was back, more intense than ever before and also different, almost angry. I closed my eyes and let it in while trying to figure out where she was this time, but I quickly realized that I felt fear all around me. I opened my eyes and I was greeted with her silhouette standing 2 feet away and framed against the TV screen. That was now only bright white static without any sound. She shattered the silence with an almost inaudible whisper, and I immediately felt the stabbing pain again, now in my chest. This time, there was an answer, and I realized why I felt the fear all around me. I looked around and I saw that I was now surrounded by at least a half dozen other shapes, maybe more than I couldn't see, as if they were being directed by the girl. They all answered her. The volume of their collective response may have been loud enough for me to catch some of the words, but the unbearable pain that pulsed throughout my entire body drowned out every other sense, and even the fear. The pain stopped. The girl whispered again and again. They all responded, while I, motionlessly, withered in pain and agony. They repeated it again. I lost count of the times they chanted, but I knew they finally stopped when the fear returned more violently than ever before. I looked around again, and I saw that all except the girl were closing in around me in a circle. A thought occurred to me. Where was Sam? I tried to look around, but my view was now blocked on all sides. He probably fled in terror, which is exactly what I wanted to do. I focused all my energy on forcing my body to move, and suddenly I realized that I could. I vaulted myself off the couch and ran past the closing circle before stumbling and falling against the doorway in my kitchen. I looked back at the couch as I stood up again, but all the shapes had vanished, all except the girl. I looked at her face, but then I understood that it was her who made me do so. I was frozen again, unable to move, unable to look away. I didn't feel fear anymore. I only felt extreme malice towards me. And clearly, she hadn't expected me to break free, and I had ruined whatever the hell they were trying to do to me. She began coming closer towards me, moving almost as if she was floating on the floor. She barely reached my waist in height, but she somehow forced me to bend over as she stretched an arm out towards my face. I had to get out of there. I focused every ounce of effort on moving. Again, I broke free. I knew I couldn't look back this time, and I bolted for the door. A ray of hope. The police cruiser was still outside. I made it halfway to the road before the cop saw me and was out of his car. I told him there was someone in my house and he radioed for backup. Then he told me to wait outside by his car while he headed in. I knew he wouldn't find anything though. The fear had disappeared as soon as I stepped past the front door. I knew she was gone. It was only about 5 minutes before he came back out. He told me I'd better come inside and have a look for myself. I realized he must have found the bloody X on my bedroom wall, so I prepared myself for some more pretend surprise reactions. I stopped dead as soon as I walked in the living room. He had turned on all the lights now, and I finally saw that Sam was lying behind the couch the whole time, lifeless, empty. I took a few steps closer, but something hit me in the back of my head. I reached up and touched the spot. My fingers came back bloody. I looked up and discovered why Sam looked so empty. Another X now marked the ceiling. After dealing with more investigators for several hours and providing yet another bogus story on what really happened, the cops suggested that I should probably get out of my house for a couple of days since it appeared that I was now being targeted. I completely agreed, though not for that reason. I wasn't sure whether the girl would be able to follow me to another place or if she was contained to my house. I did not have any friends or family close by to stay with, so I told them I would be going to a local hotel for a couple of days. The hotel was only about a 15-minute drive, but by the time I checked in, the police were already calling me. Apparently, they had some new development in the case and needed me to come to the station. They were sending an officer to pick me up. Cue panic mode. Did they figure out I was lying? I thought I was quite convincing, but obviously the two break-ins looked nothing alike since I'm the only one who actually staged the damages at my landlord's, while my place undoubtedly looked untouched. Did I leave some evidence behind? I decided to wait outside for the officer, but it was half an hour before the cruiser finally showed up. Obviously, they weren't in a hurry to collect me. Well, that was good. In spite of that, sitting in the back of a cop car, even without handcuffs, is still guilt-inducing, and it made the 10-minute ride to the station unbearably long. I was greeted by one of the investigators that had come to my house earlier. He directed me to an interrogation room and assured me that there were just a few procedural things to take care of, and that they had a few more questions for me. He left and I was greeted with silence as the door closed behind me. I sat in a chair opposite of the two-way glass and waited for what felt like at least 10 minutes. An interrogation tactic? Unnerve the suspect and let the fear boil up while he contemplates what questions were coming. I took a few deep breaths and tried to remain as collected as possible. I had done nothing wrong. The staged break-in was necessary, and I left no evidence. I had no reason to freak out. Finally, two men I hadn't met before came into the room. One turned his back to me as he shut the door behind him, and I briefly caught a glance of a lettering on the back of his jacket. FBI. Shit, this was an interrogation. They introduced themselves as special agents and explained that this case was called to their attention because my landlord's death. More specifically, the way he died. I silently breathed a sigh of relief that this wasn't about inconsistencies or the investigation, but I was still confused as to why they were so interested. Surely they couldn't have any idea that he was killed by something paranormal. They asked a flurry of questions about the death and any details I provided to the police. I played dumb and said that nothing had been explained to me, just that they suspected it was a robbery. Then they asked me about my dog and the X painted from his blood. Still, I pretended not to understand what was going on, and frankly, at this time I was actually getting confused by their line of questioning. They obviously perceived this and exchanged a glance for a few seconds before divulging the real reason they were here. Up until a year ago, in another city a few hours away, there was an active serial killer with a very specific MO, painting X's with the blood of his victims. He never stole anything, never created any pattern with his killings. They assumed that all his movements were simply crimes of opportunity, targeting loners who could be taken down without any notice and then disappearing for a while without a trace. They never even got close to catching him and never even nailed down any consistent details about his appearance. They didn't even know for sure it was a male. They continued to explain that one piece of information about the killing was never released. As with virtually any other elusive serial killer, it was always to be able to identify the original killer versus a copycat. The detail they never released was the method he used to extract blood from the victims. Complete removal without a trace in or on the body anywhere. They still had no idea how he removed the blood so cleanly, but they were absolutely certain that this detail ensured it was the same person. I was still confused by this all, but I tried not to let it show. The girl wasn't real? This was just one man on a killing spree? That did not explain the others that had been with her the night before. Was the girl really their elusive killer? I asked them why they were giving me all this information. It didn't seem to make much sense since they wanted to keep the details secret. They exchanged another glance. Apparently, the killer had never failed to take an intended victim previously. They were dealing with uncharted territory, and they thought he might attempt to come back and finish what he started before moving on. I immediately saw where this was going. Of course, they wanted to use me as bait, hoping that he would come back to my house. He had already visited the same location twice, even in the presence of the cop posted outside. He was daring and, they hoped, getting reckless. I reluctantly agreed, as I couldn't provide a reasonable excuse outside of, I don't think this is a good idea because the little girl might come and kill me tonight. The day was already half gone, so we got started with laying the plan right away. Soon, I was back at my house, trying to kill time until nightfall. The house had been thoroughly cleansed of blood and animal remains, but the smell lingered slightly. The same cop was posted out on the street again, and the two FBI agents would stay further down the street in an unmarked car, ready to come to my aid if the killer was sighted. They also insisted on setting up security cameras, one outside the back door, one outside the front, and one on each side of the building. The feeds were being wirelessly monitored by the nearby agents. They had advised me to stay awake all night, even though they were surveilling. But I was still exhausted from my limited sleep the past 2 nights, and I wasn't sure I could last all night. At least they wouldn't be able to see the girl and her friends materialize in my living room. Would the girl even come back with all this vigilance? I woke up, lying on my back, unable to move yet again. I must have fallen asleep on the couch. Before I fully processed my surroundings, I looked around to check the time on the clock next to the TV, but I was greeted with a different sight, a concrete wall. I tried to look around more, and I suddenly realized that I wasn't paralyzed. I was restrained. My upper body was locked into a straitjacket. My legs were shackled together. I tried to look around more, and I suddenly realized I wasn't paralyzed. I was restrained. My upper body was locked into a straitjacket. My legs were shackled together. On top of that, straps across my forehead, body, and legs bound me to the platform I was lying on. Complete immobilization. Confusion, as well as a new emotion set in. Not fear. Panic. What is this? Was the serial killer real? Was the girl? I tried to remember something, anything from last night, but my mind was blank except for the vague feeling that I had encountered that overwhelming fear again. Sort of like a dream where you know that it happened, but can't recall how now that you're awake. I struggled against the restraints for a few moments, but I knew that there was no chance of escape. Out of desperation, I yelled for help. Silence. Footsteps. They were distant, echoing down the walls as if I were at the end of a long corridor. They approached quickly. I heard keys jingling. Now they were being fitted into a lock and turned. Now a steel door creaked slightly on its hinges. The footsteps came closer, but unable to move my head. The man stayed just out of sight. I asked what was happening. He asked me if I remembered anything about last night. The voice seemed familiar, but I could not place it. I was hesitant to answer the question. Did this man know about the attempted sting? He must have. How else could he have gone around the security and captured me? I simply told him that I was just sitting at home all night. He chuckled, but without amusement. He proceeded to outline my entire day about how I had met with the FBI, and with precise detail about the cameras and officers, how we were planning an ambush right up to the point of me going back to my house. Then he asked if I remembered what happened next. I didn't answer, mainly because I had no idea. He took a few steps and said that he has something waiting to help jog my memory. As he reached for the restraints at my feet, I was finally able to catch a look at his face. It was one of the FBI agents. My mind was spinning. Conspiracy theories started forming. Was he really the killer? It would be a perfect setup. The ability to watch people without their knowing. Throwing off false details of the investigation he was leading. Flashing his badge anytime he got into a sticky spot. It all made sense now, except for one question I couldn't answer. Was I the next victim? Or his scapegoat? He finished unbuckling all my restraints and helped me get onto my feet. He led me down the hall in front of him as I slowly shuffled with the shackles around my ankles. At the end of the hall, he knocked on the steel door, and we were greeted by two other officers in tactical gear with automatic weapons who opened the door. Witnesses. I was the scapegoat, not the victim. I could not decide which fate seemed worse. He led me down a new hallway as the two guards followed. More steel doors, each with one small window, lined either side of the hall. Brief glances through the windows showed me that they were all the same within as the one we just exited. Some sort of solitary confinement. A prison? We came to another and passed through a gated area with a cell block on one side. Definitely a prison. He turned left and passed into another hallway. More steel doors lined the hall, but we turned and entered the first one. Inside was a stainless steel table with a chair on either side. An interrogation room again. No two-way glass this time. I guess no one monitors what happens in these rooms. The door shut behind us as he guided me to the farthest seat from the door. As I turned to sit, I noticed that the guards had waited outside, alone and unmonitored. Maybe I was still the victim. Easy enough to say, I assaulted him and he acted in self-defense. He took a set of shackles attached to the table and anchored the other ends to my feet and a ring on my jacket. No chances of escape. From the corner of the room, he started wheeling a rack with a TV on top over in front of me. He pulled a DVD case out of his pocket and put the disc into a player. After several seconds, it began playing. I was greeted with the feed from a security camera. I instantly recognized the view. It was my front yard. The timestamp read 2:37 a.m. Today's date. Then the feed went black. Next, I saw the backyard. 2:37 a.m. Again, it went black. Next, one of the cameras from the side of the house. 2:38 a.m. And again, it went black. He walked over and removed the DVD from the player. He explained that at the point that the camera feed started shutting off, he and the other agents started heading for my house. But they arrived too late. The killer had already made it to the officer out front. There went my theory about the FBI agent's involvement. He took a second DVD out of the case and put it in the player. Another camera feed. I was looking at the steering wheel from the electronics in the dash. I guess I was looking at the interior of the officer's cruiser. The camera shifted a little as the officer reached for something in the seat next to him. A body camera. A video of the killer. I watched the timestamp change to 2:38 a.m. It was about to happen. The officer's radio cracked with the sound of an agent's voice. I saw his arm reach for the transmitter, but at the same moment his door flew open and he was being dragged out into the street before he could respond to the call. The attacker got behind him. The officer flayed and tried to fight him off, but within seconds he went completely limp and saged to the ground with his back propped up. I watched as his stomach and lower body quickly deflated. His blood was being drained. The camera pointed up to the sky as his body fell completely flat on the pavement. I physically jumped back in my chair and screamed as the killer's face came into view of the camera. The face staring down at the body was my own.
Okay, monsters, so I think I'm about to puke. Yeah, I feel like I'm gonna puke. I don't know about you guys, but I've been spitting here for about 30 plus minutes. I hope you monsters enjoyed the story. The original story can be found on Reddit's NoSleep. A link to the original story will be in the description below. Oh yeah, monsters, also, be sure to hit that like button, because if you do, the next thing that you unwrap, you're gonna find a golden Willy Wonka ticket. That is right, a freaking Willy Wonka golden ticket. You know what that means. You get to explore the Willy Wonka factory.
Strawberries taste like strawberries. The snozberries taste like snozberries.
Snozberries? Who ever heard of a snozberry?
And the more monsters we can pack in there, I think we can take over that place and call it our own. So monsters, again, be sure to hit that like button. And while you're down there, be sure to subscribe if you haven't done so and become a monster today. Okay monsters, in the meantime, I'm gonna try to figure out what's going on again. Leave in the comments what happened and why we're here. And big shouts to all of you. And like always, till next time.